Hi, Luke. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on. I've been a long time listener and lurker of this podcast and
Wow,
feel like
thanks.
I'm not worthy of being a guest.
I highly doubt that. And we will prove it today to our audience as well. But yes, welcome to the CDR Policy Scoop. I'm doing this one solo because Sebastian is having a well-deserved holiday, and later on we'll probably swap when he's going to do some sessions when I'm on holiday. But I am very, very excited to dig into a topic called contracted durability with you, Luke, because recently, I think around 3 weeks ago, we saw a white paper published around 50 pages, really digging deep into like what it could look like, what could its role be, how it relates to existing policy developments, and so on. So you are looking at contract durability largely from the buyer's side of things, right?
Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar with the Beyond Alliance, we are a coalition of carbon market buyers, some of the biggest CDR buyers in the world. And so certainly that is the perspective that we bring to this. But the paper was published together with partners at RMI and the American Forest Foundation. So I think there's kind of a broad set of views that have gone into this. And the paper was developed in conjunction with a broader set of stakeholders that helped review the document, including engineered CDR developers, nature-based solutions developers as well. So I think the paper really represents kind of a wide swath of perspectives, but certainly the perspective I bring to this is from working closely with carbon market buyers.
Yeah, and so the interesting thing is we've had carbon markets around for a long time now, for decades. And somehow there are some things when it comes to durability and permanence that we have not yet fixed. And that's also one of the reasons why this paper came out, right? So, like, what is like? Why haven't we fixed it yet? And also, like, what are the buyers exactly asking for these days? What are they ready for?
Yeah. So I think if kind of we look at the policy landscape, there's been a lot of tension around durability. What is the exact number? And I think what is the, durability threshold? Is it 100 years? Is it 40 years? Is it 1,000 years? And that's really led to a lot of infighting. And I think policies ending up failing because the CDR community can't align and agree. That's kind of what we've seen in California. In terms of kind of why we haven't solved it, I think some of the previous iterations, for example, classifying nature as a temporary credit, that hasn't succeeded because buyers then take on this liability when they make a purchase, and no buyer is going to do that. I think contracted durability is an approach that gets the liability away from the buyer. So it's something that is more practical in practice that buyers would actually be able to engage with. But then it also uses these mechanisms that can get you to a higher durability threshold. So 100 years, 200 years. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago. One nature-based solutions advocate says, if we can use contracted durability in the form of a permanence trust, I'm okay with 1,000 years. Let's go ahead and go with it. So I think the solutions just haven't been solutions that work for the market. And what we see then in practice and policy is either that durability threshold is set too low, and we don't know what's going to happen or who has liability for the credit after the post-monitoring period, after, say, 40 years, or it's set too high. And if you set it at 1,000 years and you don't have a mechanism like a permanence trust or horizontal stacking, then you're locking out nature-based solutions. And I think the science is pretty clear. We need all pathways. I think this is kind of foundational for how we approach good CDR policy, is that it leaves it open for all pathways because no single pathway will deliver the quantity of carbon dioxide removal that science says is needed. So that was kind of where we approach this from, is how do we bring the rigor up, but how do we also leave it open for all of these pathways to participate in the market?
And one of the aspects that this paper brings out is that buffer pools, which have been obviously the most commonly used mechanism, and insurance also itself cannot really deliver contracted durability. And there are two other mechanisms that then um, either buffer pools or insurance would need to be paired with, either with horizontal stacking or permanence trust. And then that would basically take us to contracted durability. So does it mean that there should be always a buffer pool and or insurance, and then there also should be either horizontal stacking or a permanence trust on top of it to actually cover all bases when it comes to liability past the monitoring periods?
Yeah, I think you'll get different opinions from different people. The way I conceptualize this is either buffer pools or insurance or both can be a component of a permanence trust. I think if you look at buffer pools and insurance, so they're not going to get you to those longer term thresholds. Like there's no insurance product out there for 200 years or 1,000 years. Nobody's going to underwrite that. Buffer pools also aren't reliable enough for kind of those longer term reversal risks. So they can be components of a permanence trust, and I think they can really help address some of those reversals that'll occur in the near term. But in the longer term, you need some of these financial mechanisms as well to potentially come in, replace that credit with a geologic storage credit at some point if there is a reversal detected in a nature-based solutions credit. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So another element that stood out for me when I was reading this white paper is these different terms being introduced, right? There's estimated durability, contracted durability, and realized durability. And the realized durability is something that can only be confirmed in the case where reversal happens. So, I mean, if you look at the bigger picture, isn't there something uncomfortable about the credits whose real performance is basically, by definition, unknowable unless something goes wrong?
Yeah. So, I mean, let's just start with some of those definitions in the first place. I think there's nothing that kind of upsets a nature-based solutions advocate than saying, these are low durability credits or this is a low durability solution. And they'll point to forests that have been around for thousands and thousands of years, that have the longest track record of kind of delivering that long-term storage. But at the same time, they have to acknowledge that the certainty there is very low. It's not high. And so you need these mechanisms. And I think entering into these contractual agreements to ensure that there is mechanisms in place to address that reversal if it occurs is kind of the solution to it. And I think on the buyer side, you are able to get that liability away from you and into an independently managed trust that will manage those financial resources and those other mechanisms to address the reversal. So I think this notion actually should provide more certainty for buyers and make them more comfortable with the type of credits that they're buying. And then the flip side of that is the permanence trust idea in particular, well, and horizontal stacking ultimately should drive a lot of demanded financial resources to novel engineered CDR solutions as well in the medium to long run. So it's also kind of ramping up demand in that space as well, which is where this is kind of a nice marriage. Like we know we need nature-based removals in the short term. We know we need engineered removals in the long term, and this is a way that hopefully we can get kind of both through a single transaction.
And if you think about horizontal stacking and permanence trust as two of these, viable tools to, make the picture whole when it comes to contracted durability, is the idea that both will be around or used, or one would be around until the other one is, or like, I know there are several permanence trusts being established. So horizontal stacking will be used until there is a permanence trust that is available to be used, for example. Like how do you think about it? How are the buyers thinking about it as well? Like what are their preferences?
So I think it depends exactly on how you're approaching this. I think horizontal stacking kind of in the model that Google has described is pairing super pollutants with a longer term removal at the end of kind of the expiration of the radiative forcing of that super pollutant. And that, I think, has long-term viability on its own because there's certainty of when the radiative forcing expires from methane or nitrous oxide or F gases. And so you can enter into a contract today for that longer term removal, knowing exactly what the date is for it. So if you're pairing super pollutants, an engineered CDR, I think horizontal stacking can move forward regardless of what happens with the horizontal trust. I think when you're pairing nature-based solutions with engineered CDR, if you're going to do horizontal stacking, it's going to end up looking a lot like a permanence trust at the end of the day. And either you take on that liability yourself and commit to replacing that credit if a reversal occurs, or you go down the permanence trust pathway where you offload that liability, you do an upfront contribution into that permanence trust, and then it's managed elsewhere. So I think in the long run, if you're looking at pairing nature-based solutions, probably the horizontal stacking approach isn't going to be the path forward. It's going to be something more like a permanence trust, which ultimately is a form of horizontal stacking. It just brings in other mechanisms to help manage that risk.
Yeah, I mean, to me, permanence trust, it does. I mean, when we get the economies of scale and we get this working, it just makes so much sense. And I'm always just surprised, like, how come we didn't get to this point earlier that we start building these things? But well, here we are today, right, having these conversations. There is also obviously a price tag involved for the projects should they be engaged in contractual durability. So how much, and typically nature-based removals are cheaper than engineered removals. This is bound to increase the price. Like, how much do you think the impact will be? Do you think it could be something that also deters some buyers who are looking at getting, certain portfolio price levels?
Yeah. So I think, the first answer is it depends on the project. And so part of determining how much needs to go into the permanence trust is based on the risk profile of the project itself. American Forest Foundation right now is doing research, and I understand they'll be publishing a white paper later this year, which will, I think, start to touch on kind of what the pricing and what this is going to look like. My favorite question to people at conferences that are into the permanence trust is, how much do you think it's going to cost? Is it going to be 10%, 50%, 75%? Just like anecdotally, I would say the average response I've gotten is about 15% of the credit price is what you'd have to add on top of it to really capitalize the permanence trust. So TBD is the answer there. I will say that this is something, though, that makes the engineered CDR crowd a little bit nervous, is it doesn't solve the price disparity. Nature-based solutions are still going to be cheaper, and you need to find others. If you're using the permanence trust, you still need to find other policy mechanisms that provide price support to engineered CDR. So subsidies, government procurement, R&D funding, things like that. That the permanence trust is not a solution to the pricing challenges and the disparity of price between nature and engineered CDR.
Yeah, which basically means that that's why some stakeholders in the engineered removal space are a bit concerned about permanence trust approach, because it could actually drive some buyers away from engineered removals for cheaper nature-based credits that they then use with contracted durability, right?
Yeah, and I mean, in the medium to long run, I think this is going to be fantastic in terms of driving demand in the engineered space, but these are companies that need to stay viable in the next 10, 20, 30 years. So there is, concern of what this means in the near term and upfront for
So
that.
one of the interesting aspects was looking at specific case studies, right, in this paper, specific, let's say, policy developments, if we can call these policy, or let's say carbon markets governance developments, and linking contract durability to those. So that's the California, that's the EU, that's the Paris Agreement Creating Mechanism, SBTI, and also ICVCM. Where are we closest today on making use of contracted durability? Is that the Paris Agreement Creating Mechanism?
Yeah, so I mean, I know that the Paris Agreement crediting mechanism put out a consultation on mechanisms, financial mechanisms that can be used to meet durability requirements. I haven't dove into that, but I think the fact that consultation is out there, the fact that it's kind of already built in as a pathway is one area where it can be operationalized fairly quickly. California right now is developing their state level CDR regulations through process under SB 905. And so they started those consultations focusing really on DAC and BECS, but they made it clear that they're going to start looking at other pathways as well. And so I think there's an opportunity to potentially embed this approach in the California CDR program through 905. And then obviously there's movement into this fall in the EU as well. So there's a lot happening over the next like 6 to 12 months. That's why we wanted to make sure that we kind of got this concept out there in advance of these processes so that it could be digested by these policymakers.
And if you look at the SBTI and Net Zero Standard version 2, where we now had the final version come out, happy with the potential kind of review of how the contracted durability could play a role in there?
Yeah, I think it's kind of wide open there. I think they've made it clear that they're going to do consultations on this, and the requirement doesn't kick in for another 10 years. So there is time for them to work all of this out. The definitions they have of a long-term versus a short-term removal are fairly interchangeable right now. So I think there's a lot to be determined there. Certainly could be a mechanism and a component for SBTI to consider as you look at that trajectory of getting to 100% long-term high durability removals by your net zero year. So doors open there, it's not closed.
Yeah, that's it remains to be seen, right? What will come out of that consultation and also the timeline on when things will actually start happening. On the ICVCM, I think there is a real gap that the paper flags, right? That the various durability pilot issues an innovation label that actually isn't CCP eligible. And I mean, CCP eligibility is what ICVCM is largely about. So does it mean that we're kind of currently going a bit ahead of where the governance is still recognizing things, or what's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this proposal is to push the envelope and innovate and address some of these tensions of like, how do we have nature and really high durability thresholds? I know that the ICVCM, as part of their continuous improvement work program, is opening up durability again, and so they're going to be looking at this. And I think this is another area where you can see this approach embedded within ICVCM. ICVCM is also very supportive of the permanence trust concept. They're supporting American Forest Foundation and kind of piloting and testing this and expanding the concept as well. So I think there's good coordination across all of these efforts. We're part of the continuous improvement work program. Many people that were involved in this paper are part of it as well. And so a big purpose of all of this effort is to like break out of these silos and bring the community together so that we're kind of on the same page of the pathway moving forward.
So you mentioned that there are some different interpretations among different stakeholders working on contracted durability. Like where do you see the key crunch points that will need to be ironed out before we can, really kind of move on full force?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that we really point out in this paper. One thing that we don't talk about in the paper is what the appropriate durability threshold is. So that's the elephant in the room. Is it 100 years?
Yeah.
Is it 500 years? Is it 1,000 years? So I think that's kind of the next step of this evolution of the multi-stakeholder convening that we're doing, is like figuring out what that number is. But again, like I said, I heard a nature-based advocate at a conference 2 weeks ago say, you can make it 1,000 years as long as you allow the permanence trust. I don't care. So it'll be interesting to see where we can get stakeholders aligned on that number. There's certainly nature-based developers now that say even 40 years is nearly impossible for us.
So why do you think that there's going to be some kind of consensus coming out of it then? Because it's everyone is trying to agree on these numbers, and like we don't really end up there.
Yeah, so I think it is to be determined. I think the reality is, and kind of how we saw this space over the past 3 or 4 years, is you had the engineered CDR crowd saying 1,000 years, that serves our purposes, that protects our market. And then you had the nature-based people just throwing kind of random numbers out there, but nobody was talking together of like, what is appropriate? What is the science demand? What is going to support nature-based pathways, but also support engineered pathways? When we started bringing these stakeholders together, it was pretty clear that, and like we actually did a poll on this at London Climate Action Week last year, nobody was working with advocates from the other side. If you were a nature-based solutions advocate, you weren't working with engineered CDR advocates on policy. So I think it's important to start that conversation. I think the two sides are like understanding the constraints and challenges that the other side is facing. And most importantly, everyone is like very clear that they're all supportive and think there needs to be a portfolio approach, and that good policy supports a portfolio approach. So we've made progress, I think, on bringing the different stakeholders together. This will be very interesting, though, to see if we can align on what that number is. And there's probably not going to be 100% consensus, but if we can get 75% consensus with stakeholders from both sides, I'd call that a really good sign of progress.
Yeah, when the EU has been looking at things, obviously it's more from the emissions trading system, or like in the EU, it was from the carbon removal and carbon farming framework perspective. Then the decision was, for durability, for permanence, it would be a couple of 100 years. The UK decided for their ETS purposes 200 years, I think, to kind of be aligned with what the EU is doing. But I'm just wondering if the concept of contracted durability can be implemented, and you can basically set up and ask for, depending on how, let's say, the permanence trust is, for example, set up, if it allows for 50, 100, 500, or thousands, do we need to decide on a number, or can projects just choose, or buyers just choose, and then they get whatever they need?
Yeah, I think that number ultimately is a policy decision. And then the mechanism, if it's a policy trust, needs to be set up and run in a way that meets whatever that policy decision was. And so in theory, yeah, you could have a permanence trust out there that is designed to meet a 200-year threshold in California, just making up an example. And then you could have a different permanence trust in Europe for 1,000-year threshold potentially.
So you cannot use the same permanence trust for different thresholds. So there is a max, but you can always ask for less.
Well, I think this is the point that was kind of articulated when that gets said. I don't care if the threshold is 1,000 years or 5,000 years. That's ultimately, if we're ultimately going to replace any credits with geologic storage at the end of the day, that it doesn't really matter what you set that threshold at. I think the lower the threshold, the more likely that the permanence trust could implement a strategy where you don't necessarily have to replace with the geologic storage credit. You could just replace with another nature-based credit until you get to that 200-year level. But yeah, it certainly would be possible to set up every permanence trust with a mandate that you have to reach 1,000-year durability threshold. That would probably change kind of the finances and what the inputs are of buffer pools and insurance versus financial contributions to eventually replace that credit. But you could structure it that way.
So when it comes to permanence trusts, and we did an episode on this a while ago with Natalie from Kita as well. But surprised me, or maybe I was just a bit naive in the beginning when I learned about the concept. I just assumed, because it's all about economies of scale, about bringing in very different types of credits, I assumed that we were going to have one global permanence trust and different markets will tap into it. And now, previously listening to her and now listening to you, it's clear we'll have many permanence trusts. Is that a good thing? How many do you think we'll end up having? Is each kind of market jurisdiction going to have its own permanence trusts?
Yeah. So, this is something that we point to in the paper is this is conceptual. This does not exist, but this is something that is a real opportunity to push forward. I think you would talk to some people who think that just having one global permanence trust is the right way to do it. You could have it managed by different jurisdictions. I think it'll be interesting to follow the space in terms of how this evolves. I think just based on like how geopolitics is working right now, you're more likely to see like a regional jurisdiction specific permanence trust than one global one. But it'll be interesting to follow this. And it would be very interesting if Packham decided to implement their own permanence trust that was managed by the UN. That could be an interesting way to approach this as well.
Yeah, because the potential, the hope at least of the scale of that mechanism is quite substantial, especially as the EU is also expecting to rely on international credits that I think largely are expected to originate from Peckham, maybe with some extra eligibility criteria on top of it. So let's see. But as the paper says, contracted durability is not a silver bullet, and as you have already hinted as well, it's a theoretical exercise at this point. It's not yet a proven solution, although I would say that the solution, it looks great on paper, like it should work. So what should the proven version of it look like in practice, and how far are we from it today? I know that there are some pilots going on already, right?
Yeah, so I think Vera pilots will like kick off in earnest next year, is my understanding for the timeline for that. I think it's interesting question, like what is the perfect version of this look like? Because I think you'll get different answers from different people. I think from
What's your
from my
perfect?
What's that? Yeah, my perfect version. My perfect version is that every buyer opts into it. They recognize the importance and the integrity of this instrument. That there's a strong demand signal coming forward in the next 12 months. That yes, we are going to prioritize credits that participate in the permanence trust. That there's a really good risk assessment mechanism that adequately capitalizes it, so that projects are paying in the right amount up front so that it is adequately capitalized moving forward. And that it's independently managed by, I think ideally in my mind, it's a nonprofit entity, or maybe it's an entity that's stood up specifically for the purpose um, of of delivering on this mandate. They're not profit driven. They're driven by the mandate to protect the integrity of the climate through the credits and the financial mechanisms that have been established. And then, hopefully this drives also the demand signals that we need for these engineered solutions to scale up. It doesn't stunt their development. It actually provides more certainty to investors that there is going to be very substantial demand for engineered solutions credits through this permanence trust.
Yeah,
So big
that's
pie in the sky. Everybody's going to win. Everybody's going to participate. And we're going to solve all of the challenges around durability and move on to the next challenge that we're facing.
okay. That would be a high note to end on, but I want to do something sneaky at the very end. So you outlined a lot that like these are the things that we should get right for this to work. Now, if we try to do a pre-mortem, like what is the one thing you think could be the reason why we don't get there? Like, what is the biggest hurdle we need to cross to have, a well operational permanence trust that has the buy-in
Yeah.
that you mentioned?
I mean, I think the biggest hurdle, and it's the same with buffer pools or anything, is that you undercapitalize it and that you don't assess risk appropriately. And then you have higher rates of reversal than anticipated, and it's not, um, and you run out of money at the end of the day. So I think being conservative up front probably is going to be better than, and being more risk averse is better than trying to make it the most economic thing that isn't necessarily capitalized well. And I will say it is not an exact science to understand the risk of nature-based projects and the risk of reversal. And those risks are going to change over time as climate changes as well. And that's why I think being conservative on what those contributions are initially is going to be important.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Luke. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did as well. So thanks for all your work on this and at other fronts. Looking forward to following where it all ends up. I really hope to see a successful pilot finalized next year and kind of paving the way to a new reality in carbon markets.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm excited to see where this goes. I'm glad you gave us the opportunity to talk about it, and hopefully, like I said, it'll give us the next challenge to move on to, and we can put this one to rest.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Bye.
All right. Cheers. Bye.